Welcome to the Security News Weekly Wrap-Up for the week of 19 January 2020. Bezos got hacked. Well, something happened, so stick around and we'll do the news.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week, your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/hack-naked and use the code HN30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership. As technology continues to evolve and expand, so have the countless ways our critical systems can be put in jeopardy. Ransomware attacks, misconfiguration, user error, and malicious threat actors, to name a few. As IT infrastructures continue to grow and diversify, how do you ensure stable security? Core Security, a help systems company, provides an analytics-driven, layered approach to security with a portfolio that enables both proactive and reactive responses. With Core Security, you can reduce risk by limiting access, detect upcoming and active threats, test for security weaknesses, and efficiently monitor data for actionable insights. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/core security.
Our next webcast is February 13th with Sri Sundarlingam, Vice President, Product and Solutions Marketing at ExtraHop, where we will discuss cloud-native network detection and response. Register for all these upcoming webcasts by visiting securityweekly.com, selecting the webcast drop-down from the top menu bar, and clicking registration. I'm your host, Doug White, and welcome to the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up for this week. We'll wrap up all the topics from all the shows this week. Hopefully you watched me on Security Weekly last night. On Application Security Weekly this week, Mike, John, and Matt had a conversation about protecting data in apps and protecting apps from data, which included talk about envelope encryption, which use multiple keys to protect data, particularly in the cloud. They went on to discuss security recommendation of use input validation and whether or not that was still appropriate. Paul and I were talking about this last night after the show because Paul has a lot of interest, and I do too, in keys in the cloud and how you protect all this stuff. And we ended up talking for about an hour, so that's probably why I know I actually always look like this. But we were talking about this regarding apps. So I think it's a pretty good thing to catch up on if you're developing anything, if you're starting to use the cloud for apps, or if you're using apps in the cloud, because one of the things you're going to want to worry about is what's going on the other end. Because even if you're spinning up Dockers on AWS, or you're spinning up Dockers locally, or you're linking all those things together, there's a lot of issues around how are those keys exchanged and how are they protected on all the different ends. It's really tempting to just grab Dockers and things off of GitHub, but when you grab those things, you may not know exactly what's going on inside of them, so you probably want to explore that a little bit, lest you be surprised later when your app gets taken out. On Business Security Weekly, Matt, Jason, and Paul had an interview with Chase Robertson, who is the CEO of Robertson Wealth Management, and they were talking about the current state of the financial markets, which is something I try not to be interested in, but I should be more interested in because I get nervous every time I look at the state of the financial markets. I know they're going up, right? But, you know, what goes up must come down, that kind of thing. So they were covering all that. And they went on to review all the current prices on security money, all the way from Akamai to Zscaler. So if you want an update on companies that are out there that have shares for sale, from Tenable, you name it, they covered all that. So check it out. On Enterprise Security Weekly, Paul, Matt, and John interviewed Alex Haran and Juan Pablo Perez Echegoyen from Onopsis. And Juan leads the innovation team and is the CTO, and Alex is the director of product management. The topic of that interview was, you're going to like this one, was SAP vulnerability and SAP security. SAP, if you don't know what that is, it's a massive enterprise management tool. Very, very elaborate, very, very sophisticated. So learning about vulnerabilities in that is a pretty interesting thing to me. They also had an interview with Robert Siciliano from Protect. Oh, now I can't see. ProtectNowLLC.com. Sorry, I couldn't see it for a second. He's a social engineer, and this was an interesting segment. He's a social engineer. Been on all kinds of shows. So he was on the Montel Williams show. I think he like conned his way onto the show, and I guess he used to go around disguised as like a water department person and did tons of social engineering. He's been on Dr. Oz. He was on Anderson Cooper 360, and he's the author of CSI protection certification, which is a pretty interesting thing as well in the sort of social engineering sphere. The topic of that interview in particular was security awareness, empowering employees to care about security through security appreciation training. And he did talk about protecting children's identities and some of the other shows that he's been on. And there's actually, if you go check that out, there's links to all those shows, so you can, if you want to go watch those segments from all these big name shows that this guy was on, you can check that out. On the Security Weekly News with yours truly and the amazing Jason Wood, Jason provided expert commentary on the FBI electing to inform election officials about hacking. The headline sounds like, well, okay, but then when you actually read into it, it was really more about the FBI providing threat intelligence to local election officials and which is pretty interesting problem. Jason went on and talked about the policy and the implications that this raises for city and state and even federal election officials who are now trying to manage threat intelligence that they're getting from the FBI. It wasn't clear in that whole story exactly what the FBI was giving them, when they were giving it, and what anybody was doing with it, but that's probably something that you'll see more on in the future. Obviously, big election year in the United States, so you're probably going to hear a lot about election security and people trying to compromise that. On Security and Compliance Weekly, Jeff, Matt, and Scott, and Josh, so they have a whole crew on there now, had an interview with Trevor Bryant of Epigen Technology. Trevor is the Senior Information Security Architect and specializes in configuration management, the risk management framework, and tech policy. The segment was pretty much all things risk management, but they specifically talked about the risk management framework and the cybersecurity framework in the second part of the segment. So if you're interested in that, a lot of stuff about cyber insurance and risk management and all those sorts of things, which I think a lot of us are starting to get more, interested in. I never thought about it until a couple of years ago when somebody approached me about cyber insurance, and I was like, that's an interesting idea. Finally, this week on Paul's Security Weekly last night, I can still see the empty bottles. In addition to a lot of scotch and bourbon for moi, Paul, myself, and Tyler, we had three hosts. It was an awesome show. We had a chance to talk with the legendary Doug Song from Duo Security. If you don't know who Doug Song is, you probably actually do. I was so excited to get asked to be on that show, but he's a pretty amazing person historically and currently. If you don't know what he did, I guess, I don't know if this was his initial kind of introduction into the world, but he wrote a product called DSNF way back. And I was using DSNF to prove a point. And he wrote this product, which basically went out on your flat network, grabbed all the telnet packets, sorted them out by username and password. And if you left it running for, 4 or 5 days, you probably had pretty much every password in the whole organization, which I did. It's pretty exciting, but you can look that one up if you don't know about it. He did that while he was still in college at the University of Michigan. He went on to found Arbor, which was another company, and then later founded Duo. Duo ended up, I think it was 2010, being the largest monetary exit. And if you don't know what monetary exit means, it means he got bought by Cisco. And it was acquired by Cisco for a number with 3 commas in it, if that means anything. So, wow. Guess I should have tried harder to meet him when I lived in Michigan, but oh well. Anyway, he had a great answer to the serial killer question from the 5 questions thing, and you get to see me being kind of starstruck getting to talk to him. But we talked then about preserving the sort of engineer culture in organizations as they grow, the transition from engineering to executive. We talked about DSNF. He had an epic story about Facebook in the early days of Duo that you'll want to catch, and his current operations at Duo with Multifactor et al. And all the things that they're doing currently. At the second segment of Security Weekly, well, another legend that, again, from the old days, it was, again, somebody I had not necessarily interacted with, but I knew something about. Mike Godwin from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mike was an attorney who I guess got involved in computers back in the 90s, and he was one of the founders at EFF. If you don't know what EFF is, it still exists today. EFF was, and I guess still is, an organization that advocates for free speech and freedom of the press. And basically, they were providing legal aid to hackers back in the 90s who were running bulletin boards and who were being, I wrote prosecuted. I might have meant persecuted. I don't know. Some of the people I knew were being persecuted. Some were being prosecuted. But there was a lot of interesting occurrences back in the 90s regarding bulletin board servers and things being seized. So there's a lot of great history there. He went on and talked about a book he wrote last year, so you should check that out. I definitely remembered it wasn't a tweet, but it was like a tweet. The sysop on a bulletin board called Well of Chaos that I was a member of. The FBI were literally breaking down the doors of wherever he was located. And he was sort of like doing the equivalent of tweeting it out by posting messages on the site. And we were all watching it, and he kept saying, I'm on the phone with an attorney. And I meant to ask Mike if he was the attorney that he was talking to. I don't think he was, because it was a little bit later on that timeline. We went and talked about Sonos and the right to repair, something that all of us felt pretty strongly about. On the heels of the Windows 7 end of life, Sonos had products that were bricking, that were doing things, and basically, there's a lot of concern, I think, about end-of-lifing products and or products being sold, products being, outsourced or whatever, and that's a pretty interesting topic. And and Tyler was on there, so you don't want to miss that. Finally, during the security news, the three of us speculated about theories about why Bezos' phone was hacked. I gave you 4 of my favorite theories, some of which go off into conspiracy, but it was a lot of fun, and with enough drinks, we'll all talk about whatever, and all the other security news. I'll talk a little more about Bezos in a minute when we get to the news. Always a pleasure to be on that show, even if I do end up getting an inferiority complex because of the conversation, and I'm thinking, man, there's so much to keep up with, and there's so little time, and I really wish I could leave right now and go work on my Python scripting techniques, but, whatever. My favorite thread of the week was obsolescence. Sonos and Microsoft once again show us that obsolescence can be a huge problem in our organizations. When an end-of-life product is dumped, they stop supporting it. Backwards compatibility, new threats, budget, training, all those things are reasons we don't upgrade. And as we continue to proliferate our environments with IoT, I think this is going to get even more complicated. There was a discussion of that in the news segment, as I said, on Paul's Security Weekly last night. So you can hear us talking about it in quite extensive detail. My breach of the week, well, it had to be Bezos' phone. There were other breaches this week, but, this was the one that got everybody talking. There aren't that many details. There are some details starting to emerge, but we may never know the whole truth. But, of course, the indication was that a Saudi crown prince, or the Saudi crown prince, had something to do with an attack on Jeff Bezos' cell phone and extracted data using WhatsApp as a vector. There's all kinds of other things swirling around this, including theories that they hired Israeli firms to do this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Supposedly, the hack actually started back in 2018 when Amazon was working with Aramco, and Aramco is the Saudi kingdom's company that produces oil. And apparently they were working on a deal with a cloud computing adventure with Amazon. A New York Times story then went on and implied that this may have not been related to the Aramco deal, but it may actually have been an attempt to gain leverage on Jeff Bezos to coerce the Washington Post to be silent. And if you don't know, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. And maybe the Saudis wanted him to force the Washington Post, good luck with that, to shut up coverage of the Saudi Arabian kingdom and their behavior. The Post really went after the Saudi kingdom for the crown prince's role in the torture, dismemberment, and murder. I love it. Isn't it good? I read the news. I get to say words like that in public. The torture, dismemberment, and murder of a Washington Post columnist in 2018. It was a very dramatic event. It was very horrible. And there's all sorts of conspiracies and discussions surrounding that. That report was based on input from a couple of United Nations rights experts, but it wasn't clear in what they were saying that they actually had any evidence. It was like, again, speculation. So tons and tons of speculation about where this stuff was, what happened, how it happened. It was a piece of malware pushed in through WhatsApp. At least that was released. Things to read up on this week that I was reading up on, a lot of it because of the guests we were going to have on Security Weekly. I was reading up on open source, the Electronic Freedom Foundation, and Right to Repair. So those are all big issues that I read up. Paul was recommending 2 books for you to read on the show last night. He's been reading these, and I know he's really into them. The Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project. So I put them on my reading list. I had not read either one of those books. They look pretty interesting. I put links to them on the wiki. My malware of the week was Mustic. Mustic malware adding new tricks. It's an old malware that was based on the Scarab malware from some years ago. But this malware uses botnets to exploit all sorts of things in your network, but primarily focuses on Linux services like WordPress and Drupal. It apparently had been updated. The story that I was reading, it was updated to include a new scanner that allows it to attack Tomato routers. And if you don't know, Tomato was an open source firmware that some of us, me in particular, had been using to build out custom routers for clients. Mine were built quite a while ago, but I actually called one of those clients and said, "Are you still using these things?" And they said, yes, they were. The exploit, basically like other things that Mustic does, goes out and it looks for default credentials in the firmware, and then it infects the router with the botnet, which, because those routers were, again, Linux based. So if you have Tomato routers or you've worked with Tomato routers, you may want to check that out. And the top news from all the shows then, obviously my top story, which I'm not going to revisit and beat on anymore, was the technical report, which I included on the Bezos phone hack. I already talked about it. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. We talked about it on the show a little bit last night. Actually, we talked about a whole bunch on the show last night. So, I mean, it's out there. Probably more news will come up, and next week we'll be talking about it again. I really thought this next story about Sonos was quite interesting. It was, do you own the things you buy? And I like this story because it was a discussion about what rights you have when you purchase something like a phone or you purchase an IoT device. And what happens to that when the manufacturer moves on? They discontinue the product, they sell the product or whatever. What rights do you have? Probably none. I remember an old issue with a game. This was a long, long time ago, like back in the 90s. And it was a game I bought, and I was going to try to play the game. And we played it for a while. I don't play games a lot, but I was fooling around with it. And it required this connection to this back-end server in order to run. And a couple of years after, one of my students was asking me about, I was teaching a game programming class, and one of my students was asking me about, and I said, we should look at this old game because this is really up the, at least down the path of what you want to do. And we found out that the company had gone out of business, or had been sold, actually, and the new company that had bought the rights to the game did not support the servers, and the game wouldn't work. So, what happens when your drone swarm stops? So you bought 100 drones to patrol your property and defend you against all comers, and suddenly the manufacturer goes out of business, and the server that was being used to, manage the software for the drones stops working. The add-ons you bought are no longer available. et cetera, et cetera. Gamers know about this a lot. So if you talk to gaming community, you'll hear them talk about these kind of things all the time because they go in, they invest a lot of money in a game, they buy add-ons to it, and suddenly the company goes bankrupt or gets purchased, and they just kind of send out a letter saying, sorry. The other piece of that would be even your car is probably, now connected to a back-end server somewhere. So maybe when that car is 20 years old and they stop supporting the model, they may stop supporting, updates for your car. So that gets a little bit scary. But there was a lot of discussion about that on Security Weekly last night as well. The NSA this week offered guidance on mitigating cloud flaws. This is an interesting article to read. I did put a link to both the news article as well as the guidance itself. This was talking about their recommendations for improving your security posture in the cloud, which I think is probably a pretty important thing to get started doing now. If you're using the cloud, which you probably are. That stuff scares me a lot because it's out there. We're all using it, and there's a lot of potential for things to be a problem. Microsoft announced that possibly 250 million customer records had been exposed online since early December. This was, another sort of black mark on Microsoft recently. They've had all sorts of problems with 0 days. They haven't patched in Internet Explorer and other vulnerabilities that have been coming up in crypto and so forth. This was yet another example of an elastic database misconfiguration in the cloud. Everyone has databases. Everyone is starting to move them into the cloud. And when you do that, they're going to be particularly vulnerable for that. Bob Diachinko of Comparitech security research team notified Microsoft, and they did secure this problem very fast, like he said, less than 24 hours. It's not clear, according to them, if any data was actually lost, but it was out there. Misconfigured security rules on a cloud server was the culprit. Imagine that. So not a real shocker there, but nevertheless, it was out there. My top story this week on Security News was about Clearview's AI facial recognition app. Everybody's sort of scared of this. It started to be this whole big issue about privacy, about can AI now. That particular story was about Clearview scanning social media to collect photographs that had been tagged with names. There's a lot of issues surrounding this, but it's a giant threat to privacy. There was a whole series of stories about this type of thing. At the same time that was coming out, the CEO of Google Alphabet was encouraging the United States to adopt the EU model, which has imposed a temporary ban on facial recognition until laws could catch up with the tech. And, good luck with that. At the same time, in the United States, Congress was holding hearings collecting information on the dangers of AI and privacy invasion. And the White House went on to say they felt that any attempt to limit these technologies might stifle innovation in that what they, I guess, deemed, that was from the CTO of the White House. They don't want to stifle any innovation in that very possibly, important space going forward. So what will come of it, it's hard to say. Posted a whole stack of articles there you can take a look at if you're interested in this sort of privacy issue, the AI facial recognition issue. We all know there's a lot of concerns about facial recognition, especially with people of color and women who have a big error rate on that kind of technology. I'm not sure why, but it's hard to say. But nevertheless, Facebook got ordered by a judge in Massachusetts. They lost the first, it's not the first round, it's the nth round, in a lawsuit in Massachusetts, which centered around Facebook suspending, according to Facebook, tens of thousands of apps for possible privacy violations. When they announced that, a lawsuit was filed hot on the heels of the Cambridge Analytica scandal from the 2016 election involving Facebook. And this week, a Massachusetts judge ordered Facebook, who had been resisting doing this, to turn over a lot of specific information about a large number of applications on Facebook. But Facebook was fighting, arguing that they should be able to keep all this evidence to itself. I don't think this is the end of the fighting with Facebook. I'm sure they're going to file appeals and all the legal stuff. But it's basically... they got fined $5 billion previously over Cambridge Analytica. Analytica. I hate to tell you this, but Zuck didn't buy that fancy mansion by running a free service that doesn't sell your data. So if you're using social media, they don't charge you a fee. Probably, they're selling your data. Don't put stuff out there you don't want passed around. The FBI seized a domain, WeLeakData.com, a fairly interesting thing to me. WeLeakData.com advertised that they had over 12 billion sets of credentials that had been harvested, scraped, stuffed, stolen, whatever you want to call it, on various and sundry websites, from the dark web to the light web to whatever other webs we have. The domain host, theoretically, didn't steal the credentials, but they were hosting them for use by anyone who wanted to subscribe. 2 people were apparently arrested in the Netherlands and Ireland. I don't know if there was 2 people in each or 2 people in one. Didn't really say, but they were arrested, and the site had basically a giant banner put across it saying seized. So that site is down. I'm sure another one will arise shortly. And finally, in my last story here, DirecTV announced that a satellite, it's a 15-year-old DirecTV satellite, might explode due to its battery basically being degraded. Being in space is tough. It's a bad place to be, and it's hard on equipment. DTV requested temporary authority from the FCC to run an emergency operation to reduce the risk to other satellites that are also in geostationary orbit. Because remember, physics really sucks. And when the satellite explodes, the cloud of debris will, of course, remain wherever it ends up. So basically, you got all those rules about physics that are going to determine where those little pieces of satellite end up. And when your satellite's up there whirling around too, although these aren't whirling, they're just staying in one place, but it may end up interfering with those other ones. It's a mess out there. This satellite's just a backup for an Alaska service that they're providing, but I guess there's irreversible damage, and this explosion may, take out who knows what. So if you see something exploding in the night sky, it's probably not Betelgeuse yet, although, Betelgeuse may explode anytime soon, anytime within the next 100,000 years, which in astronomical terms is kind of soon. So we may get to see a supernova, or we may have to wait 50,000 years. Who knows? But that's a news wrap-up for the week of 19 January 2020. I'm Doug White from Roger Williams University, and I'll see you next week with more shows and more security news. Thanks.